The very final talk in SaaS Monster. So let me remind you one last time, go to your profile, go to the Web Summit app, have a look at your profile, top left-hand corner, and go to Slido, Q&A and polls, and pick the SaaS Monster stage, and send in a couple of questions if you wish. So we may not have time for the questions actually at this stage because we're running close on time. So to conclude today's proceedings, customers will continue to demand solutions in terms of security breaches for threat detection and prevention, while maximizing internal resources to deliver faster, better, more scalable resources. So to talk about this endpoint security and setting a new standard in the domain, please welcome on stage the President and CEO of CrowdStrike, George Kurtz.
All right, well, I've got the brave few souls that are left here, and I'm the only thing standing between you and cocktails, I see. So we're going to run through a little bit about my history in CrowdStrike and why SaaS is such an important component of delivering endpoint security. So a little bit about me. I've been in security about 25 years. This is my second company that I actually started. And I'll talk about my journey into CrowdStrike and really what set me on this journey while I was at various companies. So my first company I sold to McAfee. I spent about 7 years there in various roles. And my last role was the worldwide CTO. So the question is, what is CrowdStrike? Why am I here talking to you today? Well, we're a leader in delivering endpoint security via SaaS model. We were the first company to actually deliver SaaS endpoint security, and that was in 2011. And when I started the company, everybody thought I was crazy. It took a lot of money and a lot of investors to actually get here. But what's so special about CrowdStrike? And why are we at the SaaS Monster talk? Well, we're actually one of the largest, fastest at-scale growing SaaS companies in the world. And we have one of the largest data sets in security. So really what I want to take you through is how I think about the SaaS business model, how I've applied it to security, how I think about data, and kind of merge all that together. It's a pretty complicated subject, so I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of security details, but I think taking you through the journey of what's out there, how I think about it, and hopefully leaving you with a few tidbits you can take back. So as I mentioned, my last couple years when I was at McAfee, I was a worldwide CTO, and this is a funny, interesting story because it's a job that I had turned down actually 2 times. I took it the 3rd time. I was a general manager working in various different business units, and the CEO at the time came to me and said, hey, why don't you be the CTO because I need some help in that area. And I said, I don't want to be just a tech guy. And he said, no, just take the job. You only have to do it for a couple of years, and you can go off and do something else. So I took the job, and it turned out to be one of the best jobs that I had turned down. And the reason why it was one of the best is because when I was there overseeing the entire portfolio, I actually had a bird's eye view into what was happening. And this is around 2009 and 10. And if you remember when Google publicly came out and said they were hacked, it was called Operation Aurora. Myself and my co-founder were actually involved in the research behind that. In fact, even named that particular attack. But what became evident to me is the fact that as an industry, the industry was failing to stop breaches. They were focused on malware and failing to stop breaches. Signatures were a big part of the industry at the time. So if you think about your antivirus and all of those updates that continually run, those are all signatures or fingerprints that come down to your computer, and it basically is a big database of bad things. And each time that program runs, you have to consult the database. But what we were finding was that a lot of these targeted attacks from nation states were not actually using signatures. They were crafted specifically to break into individual companies. And then I looked at the architecture of all the security technologies that were out there, and to me, everything looked like it was stuck in the 90s. So if you think about a lot of the security technologies that you've used probably over the years, any of the legacy vendors, they were all developed probably 25, 30 years ago, and it was way before the cloud actually was invented, and it was just an old and outdated model. And to me, everything looked like what I would call walking Siebels, right? Everything looked like a Siebel and not a Salesforce. So I thought there was a better way forward. The other thing that I saw was that crime was paying. And unfortunately, the security industry at large was actually falling behind in terms of leveraging the cloud, leveraging big data at scale. But the bad guys were actually doing a really good job of that. And in some cases, they're able to create hundreds of thousands of different permutations of individual pieces of malware, unique to break into companies, and signatures were obviously not capable of keeping up. So the long and the short of it for me was the good guys were outgunned dramatically by the adversary, and myself and my co-founder wanted to turn the tables against them. So really, what was the path forward to us? So McAfee got acquired by Intel. It was a logical time for me to go do something else, and hence we started CrowdStrike. So the path forward was really taking a blank sheet of paper and saying, if I was to redo security, what would it look like? And how would we go about this process? Well, there's a couple of core elements that I'm going to go through. Number one, it had to be cloud-enabled, right? Actually, cloud-native, I should say, because I'll talk about the differences between cloud-enabled. So it had to be a cloud platform. It had to leverage a universal agent to get a lot of data into the platform. It had to store data at scale. And our graph technology is something we're really proud about. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then it had to be powered by, I mean, AI is a nice marketing term. We called it machine learning when we started the company, right? Well, you can call it AI today. So let's look at each one of these individual pieces here if we think about cloud. So what were the category-defining cloud platforms that were out there? I think we all know Salesforce, right? They defined cloud platform for CRM. We think about ServiceNow. They defined service management. We think about Workday, finance and HR, but there's a blank there. And in 2011, I looked at this and said, well, why isn't there a cloud security platform? And think about it. There actually, in this industry today, there isn't one company, public company, that's emerged as a cloud platform. And we certainly think we have the capability to do that from a security perspective. So what did we build? No, number one is you have to start with a cloud-native platform. Now, why is that important and what is that? It means that you have to start with technology that was born in the cloud. Microservice architecture, API-driven systems, and what you can't start with is a bunch of legacy technology that you try to slam in Amazon and say it's now a cloud. And this is one of the key premises that we started with. How many folks have ever seen the Salesforce, ServiceNow, or Workday on-premise version? You have not, because it does not exist. That's the same thing with CrowdStrike. So when I think about what's happening in this space, and you can apply this to most industries, if one of your competitors has an on-premise version, they're really not a SaaS architecture. So you have to have the right architecture. Two, you have to be able to get data at scale into the platform. You have to have applications on top of it. And a big thing for us was you have to be API driven. And I will walk into a lot of customers today and I will say, you know what? I don't want to be your single pane of glass. And they're like, well, wait a minute, George. The last 5 guys that talked to me just said something different. They said, they want to be the single pane of glass. I said, no, we're a platform. We're API driven. We want to make sure that you can stitch us into your overall architecture. So there's a big difference between cloud native, operating at scale, and I'll give you some of the numbers here in a minute, and cloud connected. Cloud connected is a bunch of boxes in Amazon that will not scale. The second piece of this is universal agent, and we'll talk about why data is so important. I have not talked or ran into too many people who gave a big hug to their endpoint antivirus software. Conversely, they tell me it's crappy, it's slow. You remember the days you used to turn on your computer, it would take 10 minutes to boot up and have all these signature updates. One of the things that we did, and this kind of comes into the SaaS model, is we wanted to create a universal agent that collected data at scale. What that means is collect data one time, reuse it many times. And this is really the power of a SaaS model. If you think about Salesforce, and I'm sure there's many Salesforce users in here, we're a big user of it, we will not buy anything unless it integrates with Salesforce. Well, excuse me, why? Because all of the data is actually in one place. It's the same thing in the security world. All of the security buyers out there, and again, apply this to your own industry, they don't want to buy disparate sources. They've got lots of things, they want to consolidate them, and they want it one time. There's one thing that we did that seems maybe like a small detail, but it was actually a big deal. We spent 6 months of engineering time creating an agent that can be installed without a reboot. Now, why is that important? Well, one of the things we found is if you introduce friction into the sales process, you're never going to go into a large bank that has 100 or 200,000 endpoints and basically say, reboot the bank. It's not going to happen. So removing friction from our entire process was something that we started from the beginning with. And it's these small little details that make us, I think, unique, and it's the immediate time to value in a SaaS business. You want someone to be able to download it, install it, be up and running without any infrastructure, and just have it work. And that's one of the big lessons that we learned, and again, maybe give you a couple takeaways. If your customers don't come away and go, hey, the thing just works, you're not doing something right. So removing friction from all of this is very important. And one of the things that we've actually done, even in our platform piece, is that we've created in-app trials at the enterprise level, which has rarely been done. So literally you can download any of these modules and click any of the other modules except a EULA, and then you'd be provisioned and try it out, which creates a massive amount of cross-sell and overall high positive net retention rates. So let's look at the last piece here, or second to last piece, which is our graph database. When we think about data and how important it is, I look at it as a strategic moat. The more data you have, the harder it is for competitors to come into your space. I would use Google as a good example. Some may say, you know, Bing might have a better search algorithm, but it's so hard to try to recreate all the data that Google has actually accumulated over the years. So one of the things that we did, and part of the crowd and the CrowdStrike, is we collect a massive amount of data, right, at scale. So let's go through this. We collect 1 trillion events per week. Now, what is that? That's about 168 million events per minute, 200 billion events per day. And I mean, WhatsApp is like 68 billion messages a day. We're 200 billion events. So we've quietly created one of the largest graph technologies on the planet that we built bespoke for CrowdStrike. And it basically allows us to make many decisions very rapidly, whether something's good or bad. And you can see the stat here. We make 3.5 million decisions per second, whether something's good or bad. But all of these various events go in to the graph technology, and they're all linked together. And this is one of the big takeaways in why, in a cloud-connected world, SQL is not really that beneficial. And you have to look at kind of these links and all the link analysis. So out of all this data, we can distill this down, we can enrich it, and basically what it turned out from a value perspective is we stopped 25,000 breaches last year for our customers. Meaning, had we not been there, there would have been 25,000 breaches. And I'm not talking about malware, I'm not talking about a whole bunch of attacks, I'm talking about hands-on keyboard. But data is one of the biggest elements that we have, and it comes into play when we think about artificial intelligence. AI is a big buzzword, right? You see it all over the show. If we think about security, it really isn't that hard to create an algorithm to detect malware, but the problem is you need the data and you need the training element. So let's talk about this last piece here. Does anybody know who painted this? Any guesses? It's actually a Rembrandt, but it was painted or created a couple of years ago, right? A couple hundred years after Rembrandt actually passed away. This is an amazing project. You should look this up online. But essentially, from an AI perspective, scientists were able to look at about 360 Rembrandt paintings and actually look at various features of the paintings. And they basically recreated Rembrandt's style and how he actually painted. So this is actually the power of artificial intelligence, and we can apply it to security. Now, why is this important? Well, if we think about AI, which you heard a lot about, we're really in the third wave of it. The first two waves were failures in my book. And now, and only now, is at a point where I think we can accomplish some meaningful impacts. Why? We have cloud computing, we can operate at scale, and we have enough data to actually train the machine. And the third piece is we're actually focused on a very small segment. Instead of thinking about creating robots, some people are, if you can slim down your use cases, AI becomes much more useful. So from our perspective, and when we think about all this data, we've got literally trillions of different nodes in our graph database. So how do you tell what's good or bad? There's red, there's blue. And we actually have to go through a very robust process to figure out what's good and bad. And we have to train the data, continually train, and look at all of the features of something that's bad. So if we think about a piece of malware, right? Everybody's familiar with a file might be bad. We literally look at about 5 million data points every time that file executes, and we're able to actually predict whether that file, mathematically predict whether it's going to be good or bad. And we've done that because we've taken data from across 1 billion different pieces of malware. We've trained our algorithms to actually be able to discern good from bad. So when you put all this together, it's hard enough to do on one piece of malware. It's even harder to do at scale across an entire universe of customers. But basically, what comes out of this is the ability to predict good or bad, and we can do it across scale, not just for one file, not for just one computer, not for just one customer, but across 176 countries and thousands of customers. And this is really the power of the SaaS model, is the fact that we've been able to leverage the learnings from all of these different customers, all of these different files, and it's one of the reasons why you can get great efficacy rates with a very low false positive rate. So the thing that I want to underscore here is when we think about AI, the algorithms are commoditized. You can go on TensorFlow and get any algorithm you want. It is all about the data, and it's all about the feature selection. So when you put all this together, what does it all mean? Well, let me summarize here. A couple of key takeaways. One, if you're building a SaaS company, you have a unique advantage of starting over from scratch. The one thing that I see a lot of companies try to do is build something that's on-premise and retrofit it. That will not work. And I can tell you from an innovator's dilemma perspective, any of the big competitors that you're focused on, they're just not going to be able to take their on-premise offering and reconvert it into a cloud. You pretty much have to start over, which is the beauty of being a SaaS business, that you can start from scratch. So the current architectures are outdated, and you need to, again, start with a cloud native. Cloud native doesn't mean cloud connected. There's a big difference. Just taking your software and throwing it in Amazon and hope it works is not really going to be the answer. It's not going to scale. If you think of technologies like Kafka, which are kind of flow ingestion technologies, we're one of the largest users in the world. You have to be able to process all this data, you have to be able to store it, and you have to be able to make it available for your customers. From a cloud native perspective, as I mentioned, these are really going to be the future of what's going to be SaaS delivered. And again, what I want to leave you with is if you have any of your competitors that have an on-premise version, they're not really cloud native, and it's going to be very hard for them to keep up. And I think from an AI perspective, we're really in the infancy of using AI in security. We've got very defined use cases. But I do think it's one of these technologies that has the potential to change the world in general, and certainly security. And the interesting part now that we're starting to see is AI-enabled malware. That is malware that's basically AI-enabled, so you sort of have AI fighting AI. And there's some really interesting research that Google did on this a couple of years back, where they had a red team and a blue team that was AI-based, and they just basically allowed them to fight it out. So, you know, in general, I think it's an emerging field. From a SaaS perspective, I couldn't be happier in choosing that model. I can tell you, my CFO, when I hired him, gave me a big hug when I said, you know, we will not have anything on-premise, and we will not have anything other than subscription, and that has served us really well. And those are, you know, at least a couple of key points that I want to leave you with. In your early days in your SaaS journey, if you're at a company that you're working or that you started, there will be so much pressure to have an on-premise version. We've resisted that pressure, literally telling Swiss banks in the early years, we're not going to have an on-premise version for you. And I never forget the conversation I had with one Swiss bank where they said, this is like 2013, George, you got to be crazy to do all this in the cloud. We're a Swiss bank, we're never going to put all our data in the cloud, and security is really important, we're never going to go cloud. And I said, well, weren't you the same bank that wasn't going to virtualize your data center? And they said, yeah, when they were all VMware. And aren't you the same bank that wasn't going to use Linux in the data center? And they said, yeah, and they were all Linux. And now you're telling me you're not going to go cloud. My answer was, I'll be back in a couple years. 2 years later, they're one of our biggest customers. So I want to leave you on that point, because if you have a SaaS business model, it's one of the most powerful in the world. And don't fall short, and stay true to your roots of creating a SaaS-only model without being seduced away to create an on-premise version, because you're going to regret that later when you try to scale. So with that, I want to thank everyone for the time and attention. You guys have been troopers hanging in there the last session. I'll be around. I'm on the app, and I certainly appreciate your time. Have a fantastic conference. Thank you so much.